Hello and welcome to InFocus. I am G. Sampath. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, has announced a 25% tariff on exports from India. And in addition to this, he has also announced a penalty, which is not yet very clear what form that would take. And he has sought to justify these tariffs by saying, with a lot of complaints,
India was the highest or just about the highest tariff nation in the world. And one of the highest, 100 points, 150 points or percentages. So India was one of the highest in the world.
He doesn't like the fact that India has got a lot of high tariffs itself on US imports. He doesn't like our non-tariff barriers. He has objections to India buying oil from Russia, which he believes is funding its war against Ukraine. He has objections to India being a member of BRICS and playing an active role in BRICS. And he thinks BRICS is an anti-American coalition. So these are all the justifications he is given. And there is a lot of concern also in India about the impact of these tariffs, how it will affect India's exports. Will it have an impact on India's GDP? Some analysts have said that it could reduce our GDP growth rate by 20 to 30 basis points. So where does this leave India in terms of its options? Because there seems to be a pressure from the US, not only in terms of our trade policy, but also our strategic autonomy, who we buy our energy from, which kind of alliances we can be a part of. So how does India address this challenge vis-a-vis American foreign policy and also our trade policy in general? And what exactly happened with regard to all the WTO rules? We have been fed on WTO and the fact that free trade and globalization is the way to grow the Indian economy, etc., etc. Now what is happening on these? Are they to be completely set aside? And are we supposed to sort of surrender to these diktats from the US president? So to discuss all these questions in this deep dive podcast, we have with us a very eminent economist, Professor Jayati Ghosh. She is currently Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Jayati, welcome to the pod.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So Jayati, to start with, I just want to ask one question which is on everybody's mind. It's almost seemed like a given now. Most people are seeing this as part of a pressure tactic from the US. It's part of Trump's negotiating style. He just like to poke India with a stick with these comments that we are a dead economy. I'm going to sort of pound you with tariffs in return, and he's expecting probably some concessions from India on the bilateral trade agreement. We've been sort of talking about negotiating this deal. We're supposed to get it done by August 1st. We probably couldn't reach an agreement, and we're hoping to reach an agreement by fall. And this is part of that negotiating process through his pressure tactics. Is that how we should look at this, or is there something else going on here?
There's no doubt that this is part of it, that this is definitely Trump's style. This is what he's been doing pretty much everywhere. But also remember, his chief feature is unpredictability. I mean, 6 months ago, he was a big friend of Russia and Vladimir Putin, right? Suddenly now he is the enemy, and how dare you associate with him, and so on. Also, let's also recognize that Trump's trade deals are not to be relied upon. He doesn't stick to them. He renegotiated a trade deal with Canada and Mexico less than 5 years ago. And it came into force. And he's the one who said this is a terrible deal and tore it to shreds. So you can't rely on a trade deal that you come with Mr. Trump, because you don't know whether he will tomorrow say, well, no, I don't like this other thing you're doing, so I'm going to anyway impose this other tariff on you or that tariff on you. That's point one. But point two, I think we played this very badly, not just in foreign policy terms, but in terms of understanding how to deal with a global bully. And I think if we have to look for examples, I mean, sure, China has handled it, I would say, very well, but China is more powerful, let's admit it, and has more cards up its sleeve, like the rare earths that it controls. But Mexico, which is hugely dependent on the US economy, 80% of its exports go to the US. But, they have been very dignified, they have not been subservient, they have managed to provide concessions that also suit Mexico in terms of dealing with drug cartels and so on and so forth, without showing, complete, shall we say, lack of any self-respect and being willing to do anything, as Trump himself rather crudely described, countries that were all kissing his ass and saying, we'll do anything, sir.
I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal.
So I think we began perhaps by being a bit too concessional. And that has already exposed us as
Like, how did we, in what way were we concerned?
Well, we have no clear evidence on this, but we have various people suggesting that when Mr. Modi and Jaishankar went to the US, they offered various things implicitly in a deal, informally in a deal, which were concessions we need not have made at all. Now, once you say we are willing to give you all of these things and think that will bring them round, that just becomes the baseline. And then they want much, much more. And they also think they can treat you very badly, which is exactly how they have behaved.
Is there like a lack of understanding on the psychology of a bully? Because if you keep pandering to the bully's demands, then the demands are only going to escalate, right? They are not going to retreat.
I think that's obvious to people outside, but there is a hierarchy of bullying. And so a domestic bully can emerge as exactly the opposite when dealing with a bigger bully. We have seen this in the Indian case vis-a-vis China. Yeah, the Indian government has still not admitted that China holds any Indian territory. We have seen this, the Indian government's response to the US. But we also know that within our own country, our government and the Modi government in particular is a terrible bully to other states and to other opposition parties and so on. So bullies have their own hierarchies.
Right. Also, I don't know how many people would characterize India's handling of its smaller neighbors in the neighborhood, other countries. I mean, there might be two views on this in terms of whether we are dealing with them, the way we used to, or is there a bullying kind of a tendency with some of the smaller economies? I don't know about that.
Well, I don't have to be as polite as you're being. Let me put it this way. I think India has always been perceived as a sub-regional bully, but nonetheless with some give and take. What has happened over the last 10 years is that has dissolved. We have bad relations with all our neighbors, which is quite a feat when you think about it. All our neighbors we have bad relationships with. Now, that is something that is unprecedented and it's unnecessary and it's counterproductive for India's own position in the global economy, for India's own stability in the region. So, yes, there's no doubt that we have been very stupid in our dealings and flexing our muscles in ways that we really should not.
Right. So there is this one view which holds that, yes, we should not give in to bullying tactics, we should stand up to it, we should hold our ground. But there is also another view, the so-called pragmatist or the realist, strategic realism as they call it, which argues that, it's okay, Trump, let him say whatever he says, but India stands to benefit by opening up more, by giving greater market access selectively. Okay, set aside sensitive sectors like agri, like dairy, but overall our non-tariff barriers only benefit certain crony capitalists, certain large corporations. They don't really benefit the common Indian man, the common Indian people. So would you agree with this assessment that we could probably benefit by opening up our markets and doing a little bit more of reforms and so on?
Any trade policy has to be part of a broader industrial policy. It doesn't make sense to say we'll just open up because it's good for us. We have to open up strategically. We have to look at which will benefit our people in terms of employment generation, in terms of our own strategic interests. So we have to have an industrial policy that is strategic and employment intensive, and combine that. The trade policy has to be a subset of that industrial policy. So I'm not saying, no, don't open up, of course, but you have to be thinking seriously about which sectors and do it in terms of our national interest. So when you open up, you say, well, all right, this particular sector, it will actually benefit us and we will do it. That other sector, it will not. We will make sure that the input costs don't rise faster than the output costs, depending on how we open up and all of that kind of thing. So it's really that, the ones who are saying, oh, it's in our interest, you have to think it through. Which specific opening up is in our interest? Rather than a blanket opening up or an opening up at somebody else's command, which is what is being considered.
Right, yeah, opening up on whose terms? I think that's a very valid point, well taken. Now, let's come to the specifics of this a little bit. Now, I mean, my understanding is that roughly about 18% or 20% of our exports go to the US.
than 18,
Less than 18. Okay. So how would you sort of understand or sort of explain the magnitude or volume of our trade, both imports and exports, with the US, and how desperate are we? Is India for this trade deal? Do we want it more than the US? In which case, of course, all the cards are with Trump, because we are the weaker economy or the smaller economy between the two. So are we negotiating this trade deal from a weaker position, or are we not, or do we also have some options, some kind of leverage which we are not really considering?
Objectively, we have many options. So, as you said, it's less than 1/5 of India's exports. Yes, they're concentrated in some sectors which will be badly affected. Okay, gems and jewelry, textiles and garments, automobiles, pharma, these are definitely going to.
So when you say these sectors will be badly affected, do you anticipate massive losses in jobs of those people working in, say, the diamond cutting industry, garments, etc.? Are we looking at unemployment rising? Is that one effect?
Well, that is in the short term. But remember, it's not massive unemployment. We already have massive unemployment. Yes, and in fact, Surat and other places already have been massive layoffs because they're facing competition from a whole range of other sectors. So there will be an impact on employment. I'm saying it short term, definitely negative. But what India should have been doing over the last year, when it has been evident that there's going to be a change in US trade policy and global trade policy, is to be thinking of all our other options and developing those other options, both in terms of trade and the domestic economy. So there's a whole range of things, as I said, objectively, that we could be doing. We could be exploring other markets. Asian markets, Latin American markets, African markets are much more dynamic than either the US or Europe. So yes, they're smaller in share, but they're growing faster. We should be investing a lot more in those. That's number one. Number two, we should be thinking about our domestic market. I mean, we don't know how many people we have, right? We don't have a census, but let's say we're 1.4 billion people. If we make sure at least half of those people, the bottom half, have minimal purchasing power, that is, they have decent wages, not the below breadline wages that are provided at the moment. We increase their purchasing power, they are going to be buying electronic goods, garments, automobiles, you name it. And that was, by the way, China did that. China used its domestic market to generate the economies of scale for all of its industrial success.
But our consumer market is just
Tiny.
the middle class, which is supposed to be 150 million?
Because our distribution is horrible. And our governments do not focus on inequality. They don't recognize that what we really have to do is the raise in the incomes of the bottom 70-80%. And if you do that, you have a huge domestic market. And so we would have to worry much less. I mean, we would need exports, obviously, because we have a trade deficit and all of that. But exports need not be the source of your dynamism. And so this whole focus, Make in India was designed to be export-led. That's ridiculous for a country with India's potential market. But that means you need to focus on that potential market. You have to raise the incomes of the poor or of the bottom 80%. You have to raise employment levels. You have to have better public services and facilities and amenities.
But in terms of employment levels, we seem to be, I think, for the longest time stagnating. And now it's going in the other direction with AI coming in and TCS, 12,000 employees laid off. So if you're not going to be raising employment, how are we going to sort of boost demand from the domestic market? Because I think only 5% is really the consuming class in India. I don't know if I get the number right, you can correct me. I think 90% are not really in the consuming zone. There's a huge segment of the population which is dependent on quote-unquote revenues, so to speak. And a lot of them are just above subsistence level. So can such a small consumer market be dynamic enough to sustain the kind of domestic...
But that's precisely my point. We cannot rely on that 5% or 10% max. We have to actually raise the incomes of farmers. And there are many, many good ways of raising incomes of farmers, which the farmers movement itself has provided lots and lots of ways. Of small, micro and medium enterprises, we really need a package for them. Just a level playing field. Give them the same terms you are offering at the Ambanis and Adanis and Tatas of the world. Right. Give them the access to inputs, access to credit, access to technologies, access to infrastructure that you provide automatically to the big guys. And allow them to flourish. That's where more than 85% of our employment is at the moment.
Right.
So that's where the policy focus should be. And a lot of that would then generate its own secondary employment generation, if you see what I mean. Because then local demand, not everybody is demanding Apple Watches and, whatever is the latest AI generated kind of thing. Local demand will encourage more consumption, and you get what Hyman Minsky called a bubbling up effect. Not trickle down, but bubbling up of the economy.
Right. No, but that's a very sort of important and attractive point. I haven't seen anybody else talking about, focusing on domestic policy, trade policy, and industrial policy as an option in the context of this trade war initiated by the Trump administration. People have been generally talking about, when we speak of options, they've been talking about diversifying exports. Now, you mentioned Asia and Latin America. Now, in this context, two things which come up is ASEAN. I mean, one of our ministers has said ASEAN is the B team of China, and we have not been very proactive with regard to RCEP either, ASEAN plus their free trade partners. So is there still something we can do in terms of increasing our engagement with these trade blocs in this context?
So, I think the big elephant in the room for India is the geopolitics. It's China. The one-word answer, why we're not doing all of these things, it's China. For RCEP, definitely China, I think. Our concerns vis-a-vis China. For ASEAN as well, let's admit it, because, ASEAN has a trade deal with China. We have a trade deal with China. We are very, very worried that a lot of Chinese products come in through the ASEAN route, etc. And geopolitically, we have a problem. And I think even if I have to if I have to give benefit of doubt to the Modi government, I would say part of their evident subservience to the US is that fear of China. They feel they need to be in the US camp and have the protection of the US vis-a-vis China. And that is really the sticking point. I think we need to, and that has also prevented us from building broader coalitions within BRICS. But there's no reason for
what
us.
you're saying, if this China, fear of China, or however we phrase it, if that is the elephant in the room, then that really flies in the face of what we keep talking about in terms of strategic autonomy. There is no strategic, if strategic autonomy would mean independence from either power bloc. If you have China on the one side and the US on the other side, and you feel you have to be in the US protection or whatever, then where is your strategic autonomy coming from?
I think we really need to stop talking about it and actually recover it. We used to have strategic autonomy. That was the whole non-aligned movement, right? And I think we have to actually start believing what we say about strategic autonomy. It's absolutely essential for India to maintain its strategic autonomy. And I think, when we hear, the double standards of the US and EU are remarkable in this context, because they say, how dare you talk about it, when if anybody questioned their own strategic autonomy, they would be appalled and horrified and outraged. Yes. So I think what we need to do is to recognize that we have to now, in this multipolar world, be generating as many friends as we can. We have been very odd in BRICS, and a lot of leaders from BRICS countries have told me this. And we have behaved oddly in multinational fora. We abstain on crucial votes when we needn't, even with regard to Palestine, for example. Fortunately, now they've changed the position. In BRICS, we try to talk back on certain things because we don't want to offend the US, like de-dollarization and so on. We are, shall we say, uncertain allies. And this is noticed. Now, Brazil, South Africa, they have been, I would say, leading in that sense, a progressive alliance among BRICS. China, of course, has its own agenda, but it is very, very powerful. And I think both Brazil and Africa have displayed a much greater degree of strategic autonomy than India has in that sense.
But Brazil has also paid a price for it, isn't it? It's got like 50% tariffs from the US for...
I don't know why everybody sees the tariffs from the US as the big thing why are we all so obsessed with US tariffs? It's 15% of global exports. Please, no big deal, right? Yes, some sectors will be affected in all of these countries, but there are many more options. And I think many countries, including other BRICS countries, are working on the plan Bs.
But also a great many countries, people would say, have also rushed to the US to finalize their deals quickly.
This is what I find so tragic. The US has managed to get deals with the UK and European Union, which really were, to me, astounding.
Also Indonesia, Vietnam.
Now, so here's the thing. You see, Indonesia and Vietnam are heavily dependent on their growth strategy, on export-led growth. In India, we tried to do it, but we are not. I mean, ours is not an export-led growth strategy. That's partly why we're not growing also. But we're too large an economy also to use that in that same sense. Okay? And in any case, that's not going to give us more employment.
Yeah, but the real fear is that if Indian exports are going to face 25% tariffs in the US, and you got Vietnam, exports from Vietnam, which should face 19%, if I'm not mistaken. So then we will be at a severe competitive disadvantage. So why should we have to deal with that kind of
Because in specific sectors, yes, okay, so 0.2% of your exports will be affected here, maybe 2.4% of your exports will be affected there. So you can live with that. You lived through worse things and you actually generate alternate sources of demand. That's the obvious way. Look, you have to have a plan B, always. And in this case, I would argue that plan B is actually the better plan. You are not dependent on the US, you're not caving in. We don't know what kind of deal India may sign with the US. If it is a deal even like the UK deal that India has signed, I would be very concerned. Because with the Indo-UK deal, we have given up on the basic thing about patents. And
what exactly have we given up?
In the intellectual property, we have emphasized voluntary rather than compulsory patenting. And that's terrible because that reduces the capacity of India to impose compulsory licenses. One of the reasons why some of the cancer drugs today in India are affordable at all, even for CGHS or for people in the richer groups, is because we imposed a compulsory license on. And so if
this could lead to increase in drug prices.
Massive, not just a little
Why
bit.
did we agree to this kind of...
Very good question. We are not informed about any of these things,
I don't think we were even that desperate, like within the case of the US, let us say. I mean, UK is a much smaller...
2.3% of our exports.
It's a much smaller economy than India.
It's a smaller economy. It's not a dynamic economy at the moment. There was really no need to do this. And, once you've done it with the US, you have to... UK.
With the UK, yeah.
You have to do it for Europe. You have to do it for the US, which is a disaster. And if you notice, very little media coverage on that aspect.
The Hindu had a
very good article by Biswajit Dhar, which I think pointed to this issue. But, that's the big thing. Why did we agree to that? All of these negotiations are done in secret. I am really worried at what the Indian government may give in to. And then they will come back and say, we saved agriculture, which frankly is no big deal. You have to save agriculture. You will not survive, no matter how much you can try and rig elections, you will not survive in India if you actually do allow US heavily subsidized multinational conglomerates to invade our domestic market.
So what exactly is the US seeking in terms of agricultural and concessions in agri and dairy?
They want an opening up of our farming sector and dairy sectors, which will destroy livelihoods. Because, they heavily subsidize agriculture, WTO compatible and all of that. And they have these huge multinational conglomerates that have deep pockets and will be willing to flood the market with much cheaper goods until they wipe out local producers, which has happened in many, many countries. Okay, that's number one. Similar with both agriculture and dairy. But also they want all kinds of other rules. They want special concessions for American companies, US companies only, with regard to environmental regulation, investment rules, other regulations that we impose, health regulations. They want US safety standards for GMO to be applied to India. All kinds of things.
That's a matter of sovereignty also, right? I mean, it's not just...
All of these are matters of sovereignty, all of them. And remember, agriculture for us is strategic. Food is strategic. And food can be a weapon. We are seeing that it's still a weapon, right? It's being used in Palestine against the people of Gaza. We really have to preserve our strategic autonomy and our national sovereignty on these critical areas.
Okay, on this, I'm really struck by this contradiction. You seem really worried about whether our government would be able to preserve our strategic sovereignty, national sovereignty in terms of all these demands which the US is clearly making on the Indian negotiators. But at the same time, we have the most nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic regime in the history of the country. So on the one hand, you have this extreme patriots in charge. On the other hand, we have really deep concerns about whether we would be able to protect our sovereign interests. How do you sort of resolve this contradictory kind of a thing?
I don't call them patriots. How are they patriots? They're Hindu majoritarians who want to impose a particular type of theological state on the country. To me, they are not patriotic, they're anti-patriotic. I do believe this.
Right. Well, we'll come back to that at a later stage if there is time, Jayati. Now, coming back to the plan B you mentioned. Now, as far as the reports we can go by, which have come in the media in terms of how we are planning to respond, one plan is that the government has apparently asked every ministry to come up with a list of reasonable concessions that we can offer the Americans to sort of sweeten the deal for them. So what do you think if we can really offer them? Like you gave the example of Mexico, which made concessions which suited Mexico. So in terms of compromises which suit us and which the Americans might like as well, what are the things that we can offer them?
This is an interesting question because in Mexico, there is the whole issue of drug cartels and a lot of drug import into the US and so on. In the Indian case, what they really want to do is to strategically open up our markets to their investors and their exporters. We have potentially a very large domestic market. We have to look at those sectors that would not impact employment very dramatically. Now, it's true, we have a massive luxury car sector, for example. I'm not a big fan of encouraging luxury car imports, but if that's what they want to do, okay, fine, so be it, no big deal. However, we have to protect the small and medium and micro and the two-wheeler industry. And you know what I mean? So, in other words, in each sector, it would be extremely differentiated, I would say. But also, I think our position overall must not be one of, here are the concessions we're willing to offer. Let's have a slightly different approach because we began with that one. Saying, oh, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. Instead of that, let's say, well, wait a minute. Step back. Let's wait. Let's have these tariffs. Let's see what the impact is. And let's see what else we can do to avoid the worst impacts. And then come back maybe a year later and see whether we definitely do need a trade deal. I really worry about a rushed trade deal. I think it would be extremely damaging for India.
So you are more worried about a rushed trade deal where we might end up conceding more than we should, rather than the impact of these tariffs on India's growth.
Yes.
So some people are saying it could affect our GDP growth rate by 20 to 30 basis points.
So let's get serious. How much is that?
6.2 to 6.
So really, are we worried? And let's be honest. Of that 6.2, how much actually goes to 80% of the population? You yourself have just mentioned. Hardly any of it goes to it. So yes, our elites may stop living the incredible high life that they've been living over the last 10 years. It's okay. We have to have a medium-term perspective on what is good for the Indian people.
Right. And what happens to the whole WTO framework with all of this?
That's dead. It's a pretense right now, right? Once the UK and EU agreed to deals with the US, they declared it dead because those are completely against the WTO. It's very interesting that the same UK and US want to impose WTO rules on the rest of us. And we then say, oh, no, but we will try and make it WTO compatible. Please. They have declared it dead.
So do we then go for, there is this whole talk of capitalism reset. Is this, from what I understood, capitalism reset was in the framework of, rejigging capitalism for climate change and, more equality in distribution of income and so on. But now capitalism reset is being used in the context of this tariff war and protectionism coming to the forefront. So what does this capitalism reset actually mean in this context? And is there a case to be made for some kind of a realist approach in this context?
Okay, so in terms of what I would like, obviously I would like the progressive variant of capitalism reset. In terms of realism, for me, realism is not sucking up to the US or, whatever. For me, realism is coalition-based activities. And those can be issue-based coalitions. They don't have to be one grouping that covers everything. So within BRICS, maybe we go for better arrangements in terms of, how we do our market clearing, BRICS Clear, for example, instead of SWIFT. Maybe we go for different kinds of trade credit. Maybe we look for different kinds of banking, development banking. We build up the new development bank as a source of funding and for medium-term and long-term projects. Maybe with Africa, we have a different set of issues.
You mentioned BRICS here. I think one view in many sections, influential sections of the Indian strategic establishment is that BRICS is now more or less, it's following China's agenda, and it's basically some kind of a precursor for sort of nudging and prodding various BRICS countries into the Belt and Road Initiative. So India doesn't really want to go down that road, and that is one of the reasons why we are hedging and hemming and hawing with regard to the BRICS. You said we are being a little odd. So, how do you respond to that kind of thinking?
I'm saying that in this world, if you really want to preserve strategic autonomy, you have to be involved in whatever games that are going on in town. You can't stay away entirely. I mean, maybe RCEP was a problem because, again, it would have affected our agriculture and all of those things. But a whole range of other activities, we should not stay away because staying away reduces your strategic autonomy. The more you have other coalitions, the less the bullies will be able to pick you out individually.
Right. Now, we've discussed BRICS, we've discussed China, and one of the main irritants has been, of course, India's partnership with Russia for energy, for defense equipment, and so on. We've already reduced our, I think, the quantum of oil we buy from Russia. If you look at the beginning of the year to June, July, there has been a reduction as well. So, and Trump has also been saying things like, we are going to explore oil in Pakistan, and maybe India will buy oil from Pakistan and so on. So, the US seems to have clearly made these tariffs more than about just trade. It's also about India's foreign policy, especially, the relations with Russia, because people are saying Trump is frustrated with the lack of progress in sort of finding peace or a ceasefire between the US and Ukraine. So, this is no longer just an economic thing. This is also a foreign policy thing. How do you sort of see these two different domains sort of melding with each other in terms of how we approach it?
Yeah, the foreign policy part has always been crucial in the economics of it. The whole tariff thing has been very, very closely integrated with foreign policy. But it's also integrated with egos. So let me just talk about the foreign policy part first. The double standards here are extraordinary, right? We are used to double standards from the West, but this is a whole different level. This is the US, which itself is engaged in trade with Russia as we speak. It is importing and exporting with Russia and the EU. Both of them are doing that. Telling India, you are not allowed to buy Russian oil. And we are listening. Why on earth did we reduce it when it is half the price of what we can get elsewhere? Why are we agreeing to buy US CNG, which is triple the price of the oil we could get somewhere else? And so on. So, there is this double standard, which for some obscure reason, India seems to accept. That, we shouldn't buy oil from Russia.
I think we had a statement out last night where...
Thank goodness, finally they recognized. Thank goodness the MEA brought out a statement which pointed this out. That we are not the only ones trading with Russia, so are you. Which I think is a completely valid statement, but they should have made it a very long time ago, and they should not have reduced the imports of oil from Russia. That's the first point. But, I think there is another subtext to all of this, which has to do with the recent India-Pakistan episode, shall I call it, the military episode that occurred, and Trump's repeated statements that he was responsible for the ceasefire. And it's now not just him, but also his press secretary, all the other secretaries, they're all repeating this, which is deeply embarrassing for the Modi government, to the point where after some silence, he was forced to say in Parliament that no other country was involved. He didn't even dare to name the US, but he nonetheless said this, which was deeply annoying to President Trump, who wants to wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was the very next day that Trump announced this thing about additional tariffs for buying Russian oil and so on. Because he's feeling frustrated that the pieces the peace breakouts that he promised before coming to power are not working out. And he was seeing the India-Pakistan thing as this big example of his ability to impose peace. Now, I don't know what actually happened. We have two versions of it. Maybe there is some truth that the US was involved. I have no idea. But the fact that India is denying it is a deep irritant to him personally. So there's an ego issue here. And there's an ego issue with Mr. Modi, who had presented to the Indian people that his personal friendship with Mr. Trump was trumped everything else. You know what I mean? That he had this close relationship and there was no way that ever the US would desert India, which was completely smashed by the US attitude during the war, right? Which was very much hands-off and not supportive. And so I think there's an ego issue also now.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting the way you sort of pointed to the timing. The one day you have the statement in Parliament saying the US had nothing to do with it, and the next day we have this announcement. That's actually a very interesting kind of a timing or a coincidence. But I think it's now fairly clear that the approach in foreign policy we've seen over the last many years, which is based on interpersonal rapport between the top leaders, our prime minister and other. I think that is no longer working, at least with the US president, who's been like purely transactional, so to speak. I mean, all the warmth and friendship, I think, don't really count for much when it comes to certain trade interests and certain whatever ego aspect, as you put it. One last question, Jayati,
before can I just say that that actually never worked. It was a complete blunder on the part of the Indian foreign policy establishment that we have today to think that would dominate over actual geopolitics. It's never been the case. That is just the personal relationship. And putting all our eggs into that basket was completely foolish, but also it was so badly exposed. I think that last India-Pakistan episode was possibly the first time in independent India's history that nobody supported us. And that's really shocking.
I think Israel supported us.
Yeah, the less about that, the better. Right. We all know what Israel means when it talks about self-defense, yes. So that's a shock, right? You're supposedly a leader of all these, group of 77 countries. You're supposed to be a major player in South Asia. You have all the contacts in BRICS, etc. You're a big global leader. Not one country, except for pariah Israel, is willing to support you. That's a real comment on how desperately bad our foreign policy has been after a terrorist attack on innocents in Kashmir.
Right. Now, Jayati, one last question. I mean, again, to do with foreign policy and our trade and economic policy-related events which are coming up. One, of course, is that we are going to be hosting BRICS next year. And this year, again, we are going to be hosting Quad in November, where Trump is expected. So these are like two sort of, again, in different directions. And Trump is allergic to BRICS. Okay, and BRICS is seen as an anti-US coalition, but we are, as our foreign minister pointed out, the only country which has a foot in these diverse or very opposing kind of constellations, one Quad and one BRICS. So how do you think this is going to go? Because November is also the time, I think, when we are supposed to have a trade deal in place with the US. So what are your thoughts, closing thoughts on this?
Let me be honest, I hope we don't have a trade deal by November with the US, because a rushed trade deal is not going to be good for India. I really do believe that. So I'm personally hoping that no, they haven't been able to come to a deal.
I think rushed is the word, because trade deals generally take 3 to 4 years. We want to do this in 7 months.
And after 3 or 4 years, we got a relatively bad deal with the UK, where we gave up a lot on some strategic areas. Okay, imagine what we would do in this short time. On Quad, Trump has been downplaying Quad. He's now created something called Squad, which excludes India and includes, I forget, is it Philippines or some other countries? Okay? So he's been downplaying it, but so much depends on his moods, right? We really don't know. We really don't even know what his equation will be with Putin by November. Maybe he'll be back to being friends again. So, a lot of this is uncertain. So I would say that given the trajectory we've observed in the last 4 months, it is already too early to be predicting what will happen in November. because now there are many meetings that there is certainly a BRICS meeting that India will host. Before that, there is the COP in Brazil. There is there's another major meeting, the World Social Summit.
There's SEO also, I think, happening.
There's the Shanghai Coordination, which again India has a problematic kind of a relationship with. So many different moving pieces on that chessboard. It's a bit difficult to predict. But what I do believe is that our foreign policy has to get its act together much better, and it has to be integrated with a trade policy that is in turn strongly integrated with an industrial and employment policy. So for all of that, you really need a medium-term vision. You basically need a planning commission, which we don't have anymore. But at least you have to have people who have the ability to think 5 years ahead.
Right, an integration of foreign policy with the trade policy and an industrial policy aligned
And
with a common
employment
vision.
policy.
Yes, employment too. I think that's in our biggest national interest, so to speak, even though employment is never really taken in the same sentence as national interest and so on and so forth. Thank you so much, Jayati, for joining us at InFocus in the Hindu. It was really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
It was fun.